The wind didn't just blow in the high Sierras. It hunted. Silas Thorne knew that wind. He'd lived with it for 15 years, ever since he'd traded his Union Blue for a cabin built of cedar and solitude. Silas was a man made of hard angles and scar tissue. He didn't expect much from the world, and in return, the world left him alone. He had his horse, a Sharp's rifle that never missed, and a heart that he buried under the permafrost a long time ago. But that morning, the mountain decided to give him something back. Silas was out checking the fence line near the Devil's Throat, a jagged ravine where the air always felt 10 degrees colder. The snow was waist-deep in the drifts, a blinding, shimmering white that made your eyes ache. That's when he saw it. A splash of color that didn't belong. A pale blue dress. It looked like a fallen bird against the snow. Silas spurred his horse forward, his mind already cataloging the grim reality of what he'd find. Nobody survived a night out here without a fire, especially not a woman dressed for a Sunday social. He dismounted, his boots crunching like broken glass on the frozen crust. She was face down, half buried. He reached out with a gloved hand, turning her over gently. She wasn't a girl. They weren't cloudy. They were a piercing, vibrant green, the color of the forest in mid-July. Her lips, blue from the killing cold, parted. A sound came out, thin and rattling, like dry leaves skittering across a porch. "Hold me," she gasped. Her fingers, stiff as talons, clawed at his sheepskin sleeve. "Please, I'm so cold." Silas didn't hesitate. He was a man of action, a man who had carried dying boys off the fields of Gettysburg. He stripped off his heavy wool-lined coat in one fluid motion. He wrapped around her, pulling her small, shivering frame against his chest. The wind howled, but inside the circle of his arms, there was a silence that was even louder. He pressed harder. He moved his fingers to the side of her neck, beneath the jawline. Nothing. No rhythmic push. No vibration of life. Her skin was like marble, smooth, beautiful, and absolutely still. He looked down at her. She clutched his coat tighter, burying her face in the wool. She breathed out a long, misty sigh of relief. But as Silas watched her chest, he realized it wasn't moving. She wasn't breathing. She was just talking. "Better," she whispered into his chest. "So much better." Silas Thorne felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain. He was holding a woman who should have been a corpse, listening to a voice that shouldn't have had air. But when she looked up at him with those green eyes, she didn't look like a monster. She looked like a soul that had been forgotten by death. Silas didn't leave her. He couldn't. He lifted her onto his horse, sitting behind her to keep her upright. He rode for the cabin, his mind a storm of questions he was too afraid to answer. When they reached the small homestead, the sun was beginning to dip, turning the snow into a sea of bruised purple. He carried her inside. The cabin smelled of pine pitch and old coffee. He laid her on the cot by the hearth and set to work. Silas built a fire that roared until the grate glowed cherry. She took it. Her hands were steady. She took a sip, then another. Silas sat across from her at the rough-hewn table, his rifle leaning against his knee. "What's your name?" he asked. "Evelyn," she said. Her voice was getting stronger, losing that dry, rattling edge. "I think it was Evelyn." "You think?" She looked at the fire. "It's been a long time since I heard it. The others, they don't use names." "What others?" Evelyn shivered, though the room was now sweltering. "The men in the black coats. They told me I belonged to the mountain now. They told me the cold was my only kin." Silas leaned forward, his jaw tight. He'd heard stories of the Harvesters, a gang of outlaws who operated out of the old silver mines near the peak. They were more cult than criminals. They dealt in human misery and things far darker. But even the Harvesters couldn't stop a heart from beating. "You got no pulse, Evelyn," Silas said, his voice flat and honest. "You ain't breathing. You should be in the ground, by all rights of God and man." Evelyn looked at her own hands. She pressed her fingers to her throat, just like Silas had. A sad, ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Maybe the ground didn't want me," she whispered. "Or maybe I have a debt that hasn't been paid. All I know is the cold. Silas, it follows me. It lives inside me. until you put that coat on me. For a second, just 1 second, I felt a spark. For the next 3 days, the cabin became a sanctuary of the strange. Silas did what he always did. He chopped wood. He mended the harness. He cooked salt pork and beans. Evelyn helped. She moved with a grace that was unsettlingly silent. She didn't eat much, but she liked the smell of the coffee. She would sit by the window, watching the... My father used to carve these, she said on the third night. Before the mines, before the men came. Where was your home, Evelyn? A ranch near the valley. The Silver Rose. It's gone now. Ash in memory. Silas felt a jolt in his chest. He remembered the Silver Rose. It had been burned out 10 years ago. The owner, a man named Miller, had been accused of treason during the war and executed by a local militia. His daughter had vanished. Silas realized he wasn't looking at a ghost. He was looking at a tragedy that had refused to die. You know, out here in the West, we like to think the line between life and death is as thick as a canyon wall. But Silas Thorne was learning that sometimes that line is as thin as a winter's breath. He was holding on to a secret that could get him killed. And he was doing it for a woman who wasn't even alive by the world's standards. But I want to ask you something. If you found someone lost in the storm, someone the rest of the world had given up on, would you have the courage to open your door? Or would you let the cold take them back? If this story is sitting with you, if you can feel the bite of that mountain air, do me a favor. Hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that these old tales still matter. And if you want to see how Silas stands against what's coming up that trail, make sure you're subscribed. Because out here, the real monsters don't always have fangs. Sometimes they wear tin stars and black coats. On the fourth morning, the birds stopped singing. Silas was out on the porch, sharpening his hatchet. The air was still, too still. It was the kind of silence that precedes an avalanche. He looked up the ridge road and saw them. 3 riders. They weren't dressed like ranchers. They wore long, duster coats of heavy black leather, stained with salt and grime. Their horses were gaunt, their eyes filmed over with strange, milky haze. The man in the lead was tall, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of a dry... I'm exactly where I want to be, Marshal, and you're exactly where you aren't welcome. The marshal smirked. It was a wet, unpleasant sound. We're looking for something that belongs to the territory, a piece of property that wandered off during the storm. Pale, green eyes, don't talk much. I don't keep property, Silas said. I keep to myself. The door behind Silas creaked open. Evelyn stepped out. She didn't hide. She stood beside Silas, her hand resting on the cedar post of porch. The marshal's eyes lit up with a feverish glow. There she is, the girl who wouldn't die. Do you have any idea what she is, Thorne? She's a miracle of the dark. Her blood, what little is left, doesn't freeze. She's the key to surviving the great winter. The harvesters want her back. She's a woman, Silas said, his voice dropping an octave, and she's under my protection. Protection? The rider to the left laughed. He pulled back his hood, revealing skin that was gray and sloughing off in patches. You can't protect something that's already dead, old man. She belongs to the mines. She's the fuel that keeps us going. The marshal drew a heavy Remington revolver. He didn't aim it at Silas. He aimed it at Evelyn. Step aside, Thorne. You've had your fun playing house with a corpse. Now give her here, or I'll see if you can handle the cold as well as she does. Silas didn't move. He felt Evelyn's hand touch his shoulder. Her fingers were ice cold, but for the first time, Silas felt a faint, thrumming vibration through her touch. It wasn't a heartbeat. It was power. They can try, Silas said. He looked the marshal in the eye. I walked through the Devil's Den at Gettysburg. I've seen the real face of death, and it doesn't wear a tin star. Do you want her? You're going to have to walk through me. The marshal's finger tightened on the trigger. Have it your way, Sergeant. The first shot tore through the air, shattering the silence of the mountain. She wasn't cowering. She ran toward the woodpile, grabbing a heavy iron pry bar Silas used for the stumps. The marshal fired again. The bullet grazed Silas's shoulder, hot and stinging. Silas ignored the pain. He worked the lever of his rifle, Breathing out, slowing his world down, he targeted the marshal's horse. The beast went down with a scream, pinning the marshal's leg beneath it. The third rider charged, a long, serrated blade in his hand. Silas didn't have time to reload. He swung the butt of the rifle, catching the man in the jaw, but it was like hitting a stone wall. The rider tackled him, and they went sprawling into the deep snow. Silas felt cold fingers at his throat. The rider's breath smelled of formaldehyde and old earth. Suddenly, the weight was gone. Evelyn had slammed the iron bar into the back of the rider's head with a strength no human woman should have possessed. The man's skull cracked, and he slumped forward. She stood over Silas. Her green eyes glowed in ethereal light. The snow around her was melting, not from heat, but from the sheer intensity of the energy pouring off her. "I am not property," she roared. The marshal was struggling to free himself from his dead horse. He managed to pull his leg out, his face twisted in agony and rage. He leveled his pistol at Evelyn's back. "You're going back to the dark, girl." Silas saw the movement. He reached for his sidearm, a Colt Peacemaker he'd kept tucked in his belt. He fired 3 times. The bullets caught the marshal in the chest, but the man just staggered. In 10 seconds, the man who had claimed to own the mountain was nothing more than a statue of ice, his eyes frozen in an eternal stare of terror. Evelyn stood there for a long moment, her hand still resting on the frozen man. Then she exhaled, a long, slow cloud of white mist. She turned back to Silas. The green light in her eyes had faded, replaced by the soft, weary look of the woman he'd found in the snow. She stumbled. Silas caught her. He held her close, his coat still wrapped around her. He reached for her wrist, almost out of habit. He stopped. It was faint, like the beating of a distant drum. Thump, thump, a pulse. Slow, weak but unmistakable. He looked at her chest. It rose. It fell. A shallow, shaky breath. "Silas," she whispered. Her skin was no longer marble. It was warm. I think I'm awake." The bodies of the other 2 riders didn't stay. By the time the sun hit the ridge, they had dissolved into gray ash, carried away by the wind. Only the frozen statue of the marshal remained, a grim landmark for anyone foolish enough to seek out the harvesters. Silas took Evelyn back inside. He kept the fire going, but he didn't need as many blankets this time. Weeks passed. The snow began to melt in the lower valleys. Evelyn stayed. She learned to cook, really cook. She learned the names of the birds Silas carved. And every morning, when Silas woke up, he'd listen for the sound of her breathing in the next room. It was the most beautiful music he'd ever heard. They never talked about what happened. So, let me ask you one last thing before we part ways tonight. Is there a cold place in your life, a memory or regret that stayed frozen for too long? Maybe all it takes is one coat, one act of kindness to start the thaw. If this journey into the high Sierras meant something to you, leave a comment below. Tell me where you're listening from. I read every single one, and they keep the fire burning in this old cabin. Until the next trail, partner, keep your horse fed, your powder dry, and never look away from someone in the storm. Good night.